Thanks to James for inviting me for this reading, and thanks to Julie for keeping your doors open. It's a favorite place here in town. And welcome to the Sedalians for driving half hour out here. So those of you who've read my first book, I know a few of you are out there, know that I'm good at depressing people, but that's not the theme of the day. So what I want to do today, since the general theme is humor, I'd like to read a story that I wrote making fun of George Bush. So the story that I'm going to read today comes from the pages from the textbook of alternate history. It's a book that's going to be released in January from Queens Ferry Press. It consists of stories that imagine what might have happened were history to have taken a different course. This story is the epilogue of the book and the last chapter. I wrote it in 2009, reflecting back upon the 2004 election, which was a very low day, one of the worst days in my memory. I remember thinking in the aftermath of that when Bush was reelected, this is going to go on forever. He's just always going to be president, and that's the premise of this. The book itself frames each story with a textbook-like introduction and closing. For the sake of time, I'm going to get rid of those and just get right to the story itself. Again, written in a world in which George Bush is king of America. Every generation believes that the whole of history culminates in them, their conflicts, their tragedies, their follies and triumphs. But we were the first to feel that history was behind us, not leading to us, but terminating before us, so that in our post-history haze, we would have sailed on toward any utopia, Aquarius or Xanadu, rather than stare back in the face of the mare. Yet history canters on indifferent to its load, and far from staring in its face, we remounted and rode upon it for decades to come. The first attack on home soil in U.S. history brought our utopian vision shaking to its knees. But we were soon uplifted by the leadership of our future king. Our king! Yes, every other generation had believed the whole of history culminated in them. But now we could not help but feel it too, as we saw the crowning of America's first king on every TV station, on every computer monitor, in every classroom in the country. The technologies we used to watch it were already half a century old, but when we saw the King of America coronated in the year 2004, we knew then what media was made for. These days, it's hard to remember what we did with all those TVs and computers before our king was declared. Watch shows about fictional people doing fictional things. Those faint pleasures were like memories of childhood, a time both innocent and vaguely disturbing. That we could be there with him, that we could be him. That was the magic of the screen. The moment was and is indescribable. It was as though something we had secretly yearned for but did not yet know that we yearned for were suddenly offered to us, and both the temptation and the satisfaction were laid at our feet at the same moment. If you've ever bought a weekly tabloid at the grocer's, paging through it to find the latest dalliance of the European royal families, envious of the beauty and extravagance of their foreign monarchy, envious of the beauty and extravagance of their foreign monarchies. If you've ever stared into a movie screen at a parade of Hollywood icons like a pantheon of gods and wanted that smugness to be your own. If you've ever known the thrill of offering yourself up totally to an indifferent lover, enduring every shame with a smile, then you know the libidinous joy it gave us to watch our country put for the first time in the hands of a monarch. The Europeans had a long history of kings and treated the news with blasé skepticism. The pundits whispered figurehead whenever the name King George was uttered, because they all had come to think of kings and queens as sock puppets performing theater for the amusement of the people. But our King George was different. He was not ridiculous. He was heroic, and his power was real. The offer, if it were to be binding, had to be made by his political adversaries. Otherwise, it would appear as though the gesture lacked unity or consensus. This was easy to arrange, as there was no serious dissent among the patriotic men and women of the 108th Congress. How could there be? King George, in his years as president, had been right about everything. Every whim, every estimation, every assumption of his was borne out by its result. He correctly guessed that a Middle Eastern dictatorship had been collaborating with terrorists in a plot to deliver nuclear weapons to our doorstep. He devised the foolproof strategy of launching an awesome missile attack in its most populous city, then training the former militants of that dictatorship to suppress budding insurgencies. He understood that by sweeping away their tyrant leader, we had gained their trust and would be welcomed with open arms by the whole country, our liberation and subsequent control of the country being the sole issue upon which all factions could agree, as we were. His successes were so numerous and assured, the mildest murmur of doubt among his detractors sounded to all like the vestiges of a pre-Georgian negativity. And the cornerstone of his foreign policy, preemption and surveillance, was applied equally to domestic affairs, so that his opponents found it expedient not to depart too stridently from the consensus view embodied in the person of the president. The president is the people, the party had taken to saying. And though this had irked certain members of the opposition for its galling contradiction, it was close enough to reality. The president was studiously of the people, that his people-like demeanor eventually won out over even the cosmopolitans of New York and the Brahmins of Massachusetts. So it was his chief opponent, at one time a contender for the presidency himself, who was appointed the honor of offering the crown to the president. This was after the president's latest triumph, privatizing local and state government. When George had moved to privatize Social Security, there was an initial hesitation, followed by a mood of uncertainty, which was ultimately dispelled by the president's common sense reasoning. Let the people keep their money, was his mantra, and if the citizens of the country felt it directly on their wallets, there was nothing to interfere with progress. When the administration successfully privatized the prison system, the president cleverly asked those who opposed prison reforms, "Do you want to pay to house, clothe, and feed criminals?" The efficiency and directness of the business model seemed to have won out. Given rampant bureaucracies at all levels of government, it was only a matter of time before the president took aim at bloated local and state governments. Critics called it the new feudalism. But the rejoinder was as eloquent as it was effective. "The only one around here who seems to want a feud is you," said the president. Soon, the moniker sprang back at his opponents and stuck. Critics of the privatization of government were henceforth branded the new feudalists for their propensity to feud with the president. The first offering of the crown was staged at a bill signing in Virginia, within 100 miles of the White House, where he returned and issued a statement through his spokesman that afternoon, stating his reasons for declining that historic offer. The strong-chinned, oval-headed, vaguely ethnic-looking man in glasses read monotonously into the podium microphone. "The president is humbled and flattered by the call from the citizens for him to assume the mantle of king. However, any gesture toward a single-party government cannot be taken seriously at this time and would be irresponsible so soon before a national election." The White House followed the second offering of the crown with a longer delay before ultimately reaching the same verdict. This took place on Martha's Vineyard after a historic treaty signing between Israel and Pakistan, which feat the president had arranged on his off hours. The final offering of the crown, as has been immortalized in story and song, took place in the most appropriate setting for a president whose most lasting legacy had been reforming the military and boosting its morale through quick and clean operations abroad, aboard an aircraft carrier. This was soon after the 2004 election, notable both as the first electronic election conducted and compiled entirely through digital means, and the last election in America for its clear mandate for the President's Declaration of Freedom to proclaim the United States liberated from terror and confusion. The Vice President stood at his right side with the Speaker of the House and other members of the opposition to his left. A photograph of the King in his last moments as President shows a crowd of old men behind him, bejowled and steel-eyed, coiffed and costumed in a manner befitting their station. As for the President, the only flourish on his traditional navy suit and red tie was a gold cummerbund and an upturned collar. This small variation on a theme somehow gave the scene an attitude more regal than stately. The anointed stepped up to the podium, squinting into the camera, and through the camera, into the eyes of every man, woman, and child in America. He pursed his lips tightly in his way as though tasting something sour. "I accept this responsibility, bestowed upon me by the American people and our esteemed representatives in order to strengthen and unify the nation in a time of increasing bureaucracy and confusion from within and increasing threat from without. As President, I must acknowledge the widely held view among our people that as a nation our choices are few. Do we remain with the status quo and let government run like business as usual, or do we forge ahead in a new direction for the nation and the world? The answer, all agree, is to become pioneers of history, to trailblaze a path toward efficiency in government for the world to follow. The nation emitted a collective sigh so long and ardent that it seemed to hiss out of the land like air from a punctured tire. There were a few factional groups outside of Washington that caused a stir. The state of Vermont even started a movement to secede, but that inconsequential cheese wedge of a state did not even go so far as to form an army. When the weather started to change, when a great hurricane struck the Gulf Coast and emptied it of its largest city, the contents of the city literally spilling out into the ocean with the tide, when the tornadoes ravaged the Midwest, leaving mile-wide scars in the land like frustrated children stomping on their playthings, when the earth opened up under our neighbors' cities and took whole buildings with it into the sinkhole, when oil rigs failed, pitiful and powerless to plug the hole with its black plumes, spilling their veins of the ocean like Marat in his bloody bathtub, King George gave the only consolation that he could, that this, as everything before and after it, was just God's work. And this was enough. The nation observed a moment of silence, candles were lit in churches, and monies poured in like a flood. When the sun began to burn the naked skin of men, when glaciers melted and the sea levels rose, when the dust storms returned, King George came to rely on the book of Revelations and the apocalyptic glory found there. He did not come out and say rapture, as there were still many contrary religions in America in the early years of the 21st century. But you could see it in his way of holding his arms aloft, preacher-like, and bringing them down again on the podium like the hands of God upon a sinner. Ah, the weather, our king's bane. You've been right about everything. Why wouldn't the weather fall in line? If reality is perception as the court upheld, what prevented nature itself from adhering to the beliefs of he and his people? The king's famous resolve and unwavering confidence in anything he set his mind to, was being tested. Industry certainly was not to blame. Industry only implemented what science had wrought. Science had discovered the problem, so why wasn't science doing anything to cure the problem? Indeed, developing the technologies that lead to waste, wasn't science the original cause of the problem? And King George took pains to ask, are we even sure it is a problem except that science says so? King George always managed to bring larger issues down to a manageable size. Back in my hometown, we always used to say, he who smelt it, dealt it. And I believe that to be the case in this instance. In other words, science had identified the problem, and now it was science's responsibility to clean up the problem. But science, like terror, like freedom, like God, was not a nation or a person to be blamed or cajoled or waged war upon, and it simply stood monitoring the patterns of the storm as it churned around us, the circle ever narrowing to include our neighbors, but we, the living, always confidently standing in the eye of the hurricane. When astronomers located a potentially habitable planet orbiting a star within 20 years' travel by new plasma-based NASA space shuttles, it was once again science, not politics, which took center stage in the world theater. All the talk was of terraforming and ecosynthesis and international alliance. It was the specter of international dependence that caused the king's men to marshal their forces and launch their ambitious mission. Suddenly, technology was the new savior, and King George risked becoming the next great American irrelevancy. But if you knew the king, you know he would never allow someone's faulty notion of progress to make him into another old news story. So King George announced a bold new plan for the future of America and the world, to launch ourselves into outer space, starting with the king and his royal service. He held a press conference to declare his intention to become, along with his retinue, the first colonists of New Earth. At first, many believed that by taking off for another planet, he was giving up on this one, as though he were admitting that Earth was now despoiled beyond hope. Some of those who had begun to despair asked, what happened to the captain going down with the ship? But what we in our innocence had forgotten was that the king is a man who lives by glorious example. He propelled himself into space not because it was the only way to escape the impossible predicament in which he found himself as king, but because he wanted to show us that we too could escape the world someday as he did. During the press conference, in answer to the question of whether it is possible to govern from such vast distance, the king stood loose-limbed and bobbed his neck like a rooster before the fight, put on his best cowboy face and said, "I'll be back." He stood on the platform leading to the shuttle, stopping to wave at the ocean of men and women who had come to see him off. He rested his hand on the corrugated steel shell that lined the walkway, and it made a warping sound that, though entirely standard for its construction, made all of us in the vicinity wonder at the flimsiness of this entire enterprise. That the machine was vulnerable to the king's touch made us all feel helpless. The millions cheered and cried and held high the flag of the empire. As he settled into the cockpit, a feature strictly unnecessary to the shuttle's design but made exactly to his specifications, bone white and body sized like a bathtub, the king regarded himself in a convex mirror. He had aged suddenly, Lear-like, and everyone in the kingdom had noticed. His eyes were eyes that took everything in view and reduced it to a pinpoint of light that glinted from the corner of his pale iris. When faced with its bulbous reflection, the eyes squinted into nothing as though the mirror gave off a painful light. Yet he could not look away. His impulses were unimpeachable, even if they launched him into the void and left a chewed-up earth behind. It was fitting that the king should wander off into the woods like an old wolf rather than die upon a rug like a hound. His favorite gadgets were arrayed behind him, none of which kept pace with the latest technology: a mercury compass, a gas mask, aviation goggles, control panel with neon green digits on the screen. In the unlikely possibility that he encountered foreign life forms, the president carried a Rubik's Cube in his pocket as testament to man's ingenuity. When the shuttle launched, there was a feeling common to all watching that it was not our king launching into outer space, that it was the world and us falling away from him. Like children watching our father pull away in a station wagon, going around the corner, but never emerging on the other side. It was the revelation that he did leave us, didn't he? And he is out there still, floating further and further toward a tiny speck in the distance that will grow larger with time. And though from the outside he may look like a senile Quixote in a pod drifting deeper into cold and empty space with no glimmer of life anywhere in sight, the reality, which is perception, is that the King of America is just another confused and hungry soul seeking salvation someplace far, far away. Thank you.